Hey everyone, this is David Brown, and this video is going to be a bit of a quiz. I'm going to show 40 photos of hawks from the Buteo genus from the eastern United States. I'll talk through the field marks that I'm seeing to identify each bird and then reveal the answer, so feel free to keep track of how many you get right and wrong if you'd like to play along. Let's take a look at this first bird. Buteos are hawks that love to soar, and this bird is in a classic Buteo soaring posture with those wings spread out and also the tail spread out. What's the first thing you notice about this bird? Perhaps it's the tail. The tail appears to be completely orange from this underside view. There's a couple other things that stand out. One is that it has dark bars up in the shoulder area, what we would call the patagial area. You could call these patagial bars or dark patagial bars. That's a good field mark for this species. And we also see that the bird has a belly band. We see these dark markings here in the center, whereas on the upper breast here it's very clean, and down below it's very clean as well. So it's a very distinct belly band. And we also see that this bird has a dark trailing edge to the wings, this really bold dark trailing edge. And that's a good field mark to use for adult Buteos, as we'll see as we go through the photos. Are you ready for the answer? This is an adult red-tailed hawk. So all red-tailed hawks show these dark patagial bars, as well as a belly band. And the adult red-tailed hawks show a dark trailing edge to the wings and a red tail. Now on red tails, the top side of the tail looks more red, whereas from the underside view like this, sometimes the tail looks more orange. Moving on to the next bird. What's the first thing that stands out about this bird to you? Perhaps it's the orange coloration throughout the underside. And where it's not orange, it's this really cool pattern of dark and white lines. We see that on the wings here as well as in the tail. And looking specifically at the tail, it looks like a dark tail with thin white lines. You could think of a blackboard with thin chalk lines on it. We also see that the wingtip is made up of 5 feathers on each wing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which gives the wingtip a bit of a blunt appearance. And we also see near the wingtip there's a little bit of a translucent crescent. This photo doesn't show it as well, but it's a key field mark for this species. Are you ready for the answer? This is an adult red-shouldered hawk. The adults have this really distinctive plumage, and here we'll see some juveniles as well, which don't have this distinctive plumage, but they have the same shape. How about this bird? What's the first thing that stands out about this bird to you? Maybe you said the tail. If we look at this tail, it's kind of similar to the tail of the red-shouldered hawk, which was dark with white bands, but we see on this one, this band is really wide compared to those thin lines that we saw on the red-shouldered hawk. If we look at the wingtips, we see that they're made up of only 4 feathers, 1, 2, 3, 4, which gives them a more pointed appearance compared to that more squared off look of the red-shouldered hawk, which had 5 feathers. We see that this bird has a dark trailing edge to the wing, which again is a field mark of adults. And overall, it's pretty plain underneath. We don't see those dark patagial bars that the red-tailed hawk showed. And we see a little bit of brown markings on the underside, but not much, and it's not that really bold belly band that we saw on the red-tailed hawks. Are you ready for the answer? This is an adult broad-winged hawk. You may not be as familiar with broad-winged hawks because they're not around in most areas in the winter, and in the summer they're a little hard to find while they're nesting. But when they come through during the spring and fall migrations, they come through in huge groups. You can get thousands of them, even tens of thousands of them on a good day at a hawk watch. Moving on to the next bird. What stands out to you about this one? To me, what stands out is just the overall appearance. It doesn't have much color. It's more of splotchy darks and whites. We see a lot of dark here on the underside of the body. We also see these dark squares here in the wings, which are a good field mark to use. Do you have your answer? This is a rough-legged hawk. Rough-legged hawks are usually associated with the winter. They nest way up north, and they come down in the winter as far as New York and Pennsylvania, and sometimes even farther than that. We see that this bird does not have a dark trailing edge to the wing, and it has kind of a diffuse tip to the tail, so this is probably a juvenile. Here we have the top side of a bird. What do you notice about this one? And this is a little more subtle. Let's take a look at that tail. First of all, it has a tail that's brown with some dark banding on it. So that's something we haven't really seen yet in this presentation. Another thing that stands out to me is that on the wings, they have these panels, these sort of lighter squares on both wings, where the light would shine through them a little bit more. It doesn't have the splotchy black and white appearance of the rough-legged hawk, so we can rule that out. Plus, the light morphs would have a really white rump. This has a little bit of white in this area, but the light morph rough-legged hawks would show a lot more white here. We also see that the wingtips are made up of 5 feathers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that rules out broad-winged hawk. So we're thinking either red-tailed hawk or red-shouldered hawk. And we said that red-shouldered hawk has translucent crescents near the wingtips, not these translucent squares. Do you have your answer? This is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Our Buteos stay in their juvenile plumage for about 1 year, so you can imagine that they're born over the summer. They hold that plumage for 1 year, and then that next summer is when they start growing in those adult feathers. So by that fall, they are in their adult plumage. Okay, let's take a look at this hawk. We see a tail with wide white bands, especially this last white band, very bold. We see that it's got some brown barring underneath. We see a dark trailing edge to the wing. And we also see that it does not have dark patagial bars. And we also see that the wingtips are very pointy because they're made up of 4 feathers. Do you remember what kind of hawk this is? This is an adult broad-winged hawk. How about this hawk here? Maybe the first thing that stands out is that it has relatively pointed wingtips made up of 4 feathers. 1, 2, 3, 4. We see that it has some markings here in the patagial area, but it's not those dark bars that most red-tailed hawks would show, although some red-tails do show very light patagial bars. But let's look, does it have that thick belly band that red-tails show? Not really, it's more of a brown dotting. It's not barring like we saw in that last bird, but it's got some dots of brown here and there, starting all the way up here on the upper breast and extending down to this middle area. And if we look at the tail is mostly pale with some banding, and then it's got a really bold band near the along the tip of the tail. Do you have your answer? This is a juvenile broad-winged hawk. And when we're dealing with the juvenile Buteos, especially the broad wings, red tails, and red shoulders, they can kind of look similar overall, so we have to dig into those details a little bit. Again, on this bird, look at those pointed wingtips that are only made up of 4 feathers. That's the main thing that makes the shape stand out. Again, red-shouldered hawks would have a more squared off or rounded wingtip because they have 5 feathers on the wingtip, and juvenile red-tailed hawks also have 5 feathers on the wingtips. Juvenile red-shouldered would also show a translucent crescent in this area, and juvenile red tails would show more of a translucent panel. Also keep in mind that a juvenile red-tailed hawk would probably show darker patagial bars and have a more distinct belly band. Okay, let's take a look at this bird. This is a plumage we haven't seen yet, and what's the first thing that stands out about this bird? Well, it's really splotchy, dark, and white, so maybe you remember what species that is. We see those dark squares in the wings, and if we look at the shape of this bird, it's got kind of lanky wings. They're somewhat long and pointy, and we also see that it's got kind of a bib here on the upper breast. And we see that the bird has a dark trailing edge to the wing, so probably an adult, and also a dark tip to the tail, another sign of an adult for this species. Do you have your answer? This is a rough-legged hawk, and this is probably an adult male based on the plumage, although there is some overlap in plumage, so you have to be careful about saying for sure. But a lot of times the adult males are the ones with the bib here on the upper breast, again that dark trailing edge to the wing signifying adult. And a lot of times the males have multiple tail bands as well. And again, rough-legged hawks are a species that you would mostly see in the colder months over the winter. Here we have a Buteo that's in a glide posture, so the wingtips are tucked back and the tail is not wide open, it's a bit more folded, so we can't see the color as well, although it does appear a little bit orangey, especially on this outer tail feather here. A couple other things we see. It has dark patagial bars, we see that here on both wings, and we see a well-defined belly band. We also see a dark trailing edge to the wing. Again, that usually signifies an adult bird. Do you have your answer? This is an adult red-tailed hawk. Again, all red-tailed hawks show these dark patagial bars and the belly band, and the adults have a dark trailing edge to the wing and a red tail, but again, that tail from underneath sometimes looks more orange. What's the first thing that stands out to you about this bird? And imagine that you saw it from really far away, but in this same lighting condition. What do you think would stand out? How about these translucent crescents here near the wingtip? We can see on both wings in this area there is light shining through. So that's a good field mark. And how many feathers make up the wingtips? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So again, even though it's kind of tucked into a bit of a glide posture, it's got these really blunt looking wingtips. It's not a super pointy wingtip. Also notice the overall shape. It doesn't look big and bulky like that red tail we saw in the last slide. But this bird looks a little skinnier, and the tail looks considerably longer than some of the other birds we've been looking at. It almost would suggest an accipiter like a Cooper's hawk. And with the streaking on the breast here, you could easily confuse this with a Cooper's hawk, which have similar teardrop streaking. But this is not an accipiter, this is a Buteo. So, do you have your answer? This is a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. And again, the main thing to identify them, you can almost ignore most of the bird and only look at the wingtip. When we see those blunt wingtips made up of 5 feathers, along with these translucent crescents, that's enough to tell us that this is a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. This whole middle part of the body looks almost identical to juvenile broad-winged hawks. So when we're telling juvenile red-shouldered hawks from juvenile broad-winged hawks, we're pretty much just looking at the wingtips. Again, the red shoulders have 5 feathers that make up the wingtip, giving it a blunt appearance, along with those translucent crescents. Whereas on the juvenile broadwings, we're looking for 4 feathers, giving the wing a really pointed wingtip. Here's another hawk that doesn't have much color to it. There's a couple things that stand out though. One, we see dark patagial bars here in the shoulder area, and we also see a well-defined belly band here. Notice how clean the throat is, as well as the upper breast and down below the belly band. Very clean, except for this belly band right in the middle. The tail is kind of pale overall with thin bands. We don't see a bold dark tip on it like we saw on that juvenile broad-winged hawk earlier. It's more just thin bands the whole way. Nothing really stands out that much about it. And we also see a bit of a translucent panel here on these inner primary feathers. You can see that on both wings. We see the darker feathers here and the darker feathers at the wingtips, but these inner primaries are a little more pale, giving you sort of a square where the light is shining through. Do you have your answer? This is a juvenile red-tailed hawk. So again, just like the adults, we see the dark patagial bars here in the shoulder area, and we see that belly band, but it's not an adult, so it does not have a dark trailing edge to the wing, and it does not have a red tail. Here's another hawk with kind of a pale appearance, similar to that last one, and maybe you've realized by now that it's the juveniles that usually look pale like this. And I think a lot of the reason for that is the juveniles don't have that dark trailing edge to the wing that gives the wings of the adults that outline. So the juveniles tend to look more pale. Now, if we take a closer look at this bird, look in the patagial area, we do not see dark patagial bars like we saw on that red tail that we looked at last. And we also don't see a defined belly band. It's just some brown markings. They kind of start up here, especially on the sides, not so much in the center of the upper breast, but on the sides you have markings and a little bit of what looks like a belly band, but it's not that well-defined belly band and then clean up here and clean down below. And if we look at the wingtips, this bird is tucked into a little bit of a glide, so the wingtips look extra pointy. And if we count the feathers that make up the wingtip, we see 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have a really pointed wingtip, Looking at the tail, nothing too distinctive, looks rather pale with some brown barring on it. Nothing really stands out too much about that. So, do you have your answer? This is a juvenile broad-winged hawk. And remember with that last juvenile red-shouldered, we said that for red shoulders and broad wings, this whole middle section really looks pretty similar, but it's all in the wingtip to tell them apart. So the broad wings like this have really pointed wingtips because the wingtips are only made up of 4 feathers, and they do not have that translucent crescent that the red shoulders show. Now, you could say, well, there's a little bit of light shining through there, but that's not like a bold translucent crescent like you see on the red shouldered. But sometimes it depends on the light and the angle, so sometimes you really need to watch that bird fly around for a minute to see, does it really have a translucent crescent or not? Here we have a hawk that looks rather dark and angry. So the first thing I'm going to look at is, does it have patagial bars? And we look here, and yes, it has the dark patagial bars. And again, that's a sign of one specific species. The other ones do not show those. We also see that it has a very dark belly band, and it's not just a kind of a clean belly band in the middle, but really it goes up. It's almost like it's dripping down off of the head and throat to meet the belly band here. We also see that the bird has a dark trailing edge to the wing, and we get a little bit of a side view of the tail where the tail feather looks reddish or orangish. So, what do you think about this bird? It's an adult red-tailed hawk. And not only is it a red-tailed hawk, but it's also the northern or Abieticola subspecies of red-tailed hawk. This is something that you would normally see in the wintertime or during periods of migration. In the fall, maybe late October into early November would be the peak. This is more of a cold weather species. These are the red tails that nest really far north. The subspecies that you'll see most of the time is the eastern subspecies, or borealis. What stands out to you first about this bird? How about how dark it is? Here on the head and the underside of the body, it's just completely dark. And that should be a huge hint because there's only one species of Buteo that we regularly get in a dark morph. In addition to that, we see a tail that has a really dark tip and multiple tail bands. We also see that the wings have a dark trailing edge, usually a sign of an adult. And if we look at the overall shape, the wings are long and somewhat pointed. It gives it a lanky appearance. So, what do you think this is? It is a dark morph, rough-legged hawk. Let's take a look at this bird, and you could pretty much stick this photo right in the field guide because I think this is just the classic, typical look of this species. So we see on the underside of the body, we see brown barring. Here in the wings, we do not see any dark patagial bars. The tail looks dark with wide white bands, especially this last band. And you can imagine from a distance, you wouldn't really see these other bands. So it almost looks like a dark tail with a single wide white band. We see that dark trailing edge to the wing that gives the wing a nice bold outline. And we see that the wingtips are made up of 4 feathers, giving them a really pointed appearance. Do you have your answer? This is an adult broad-winged hawk. And again, it doesn't get any more classic than this, but unfortunately, when you're out in the field, you don't always get this close of a view of the birds. If you did, it would be really easy, right? Okay, what do you think about this bird? It's just kind of plain brown. You see a little bit of banding in the tail. That doesn't really help us too much. But what's the bold feature that really stands out about this? How about these translucent crescents near the wingtips? We see them on both wings here. So just looking at that, we can also count the feathers on the wingtips. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Really blunt wingtip with translucent crescents. This is a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. Here we have the top side of another hawk, and this bird's a little messy looking. This was a photo that was taken in the summer when the bird was molting. So molting just means it's dropping its old feathers and growing in new ones. So you can see on the tail, that's why the tail bands don't line up, because some of them aren't fully grown in yet. And you can also see on the wings, there's certain feathers that are still growing in. So that's why it's a little bit difficult to judge the shape sometimes when birds are molting because they're missing feathers in certain areas. But if we look, we see that it's kind of a dark tail with wide white bands, especially this last band on the tail. And we can see that the wingtips are somewhat pointed. So this is the top side of an adult broad-winged hawk. Okay, hopefully you're getting the hang of this by now. Let's take a look at this bird. First of all, we do not see dark patagial bars. Again, there's a little bit of markings in this area, but it's not those bold, dark patagial bars. We don't really see a bold belly band. It's more streaking that starts all the way up here on the upper breast and extends down. So we're thinking this is probably either a red-shouldered hawk or a broad-winged hawk. But let's take a look at the wingtip because we said that's how you tell those two apart. So looking at the wingtips, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feathers, giving it a more squared off or rounded wingtip. And we see translucent crescents. And again, you see that on both wings. So we don't even have to look at this middle part of the bird, just focus on the wingtip. 5 feathers, giving it a blunt appearance and translucent crescents. That allows us to identify this bird as what? A juvenile red-shouldered hawk. Here we have another top side shot, and what a striking bird this is. So what's the first thing that stands out about this? Well, how about all those crazy patterns of black and white? We see it on the wings here, and we also see it in the tail. We see that the tail looks dark with thin white lines, like white lines on a blackboard, white chalk lines. And we also see that the bird has what? What would you call these? How about red shoulders? So what do you think this bird is? That's right, it's an adult red-shouldered hawk. You're probably getting the hang of it by now, so this one should be real easy. Let's take a look at this bird. What's the first thing that stands out about it? How about this big red tail? But we also see dark patagial bars and a belly band, and we see a dark trailing edge to the wings. And also we see that the wingtips are made up of 5 feathers, giving it a rounded appearance. Don't overthink this one too much. This is a red-tailed hawk, and it's an adult. So again, on red tails, you're looking for those dark patagial bars in the belly band that all of them show, and the adults have that dark trailing edge to the wing and the eponymous red tail. And red-tailed hawks also have 5 feathers that make up the wingtip, giving it a rounded appearance. So kind of similar to red-shouldered hawks, which also have 5, but different than broad-winged hawks, which have the more pointed wingtips because they only have 4 feathers making up the wingtips. Here's another hawk that's very similar to one that we saw earlier. First of all, it just has a very black and white appearance. It's almost like it's a black and white photo. You don't really see any browns or orange or red or anything. It's just dark and white. You can see it has a bit of a bibbed appearance. See these dark squares here in this section of the wing. Dark trailing edge to the wing indicates probably an adult, and a dark tip to the tail. And you probably saw this bird during a colder month of the year because it is a rough-legged hawk. And again, the ones that have this more bibbed appearance with the dark trailing edge to the wing and multiple tail bands are usually adult males. Let's take a look at this hawk. First of all, we see a lot of orange underneath on the underside of the wings as well as the underside of the body. And on the rest of the wings, we see a pattern of black and white. And also on the tail, we see it looks like a dark tail with thin white lines. So again, don't overthink this one too much. It is a red-shouldered hawk. And again, this is the adult plumage. Here's another one that you don't need to overthink too much. What's the first thing that stands out about this? How about the red tail? So let's just keep it simple. This is a red-tailed hawk, and this is an adult because only the adults show the red tails. Here's a bit of a side view where we're seeing the upper side of the bird. The main thing that we have to go off of here is the tail. So we see that it's a dark tail with a single bold white band across it. And what species is it that has that? This is an adult broad-winged hawk. Our first impression of this bird is that it's kind of pale looking, so it's one of those juveniles. We see that it does not have the dark patagial bars or the distinct belly band that red tails show, so this is either a red-shouldered hawk or a broad-winged hawk. And again, this whole area for those two species looks very similar, but the difference is all in the wingtips. Here on the wingtip, we see that it's made up of 5 feathers, giving it a more blunt or squared off, rounded appearance, however you want to term it. And we see the translucent crescents near the wingtips here as well. So we know that this is a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. And I keep pointing out how many feathers are making up the wingtip. In the field, you normally don't see that. It's something you only see in close photos, but it helps emphasize the point that the red-shouldered hawks have that more squared off wingtip, whereas the broad-winged hawks have one fewer feather, so they have a pointed wingtip. That's what you'll really see, that impression of is it a more squared off wingtip or is it a more pointed wingtip? All right, look at this bird. What's the first thing that stands out about this? How about the fact that it has almost no markings at all underneath? I mean, look at this. There's nothing at all in here. There's hardly any markings on the underside of the body. We certainly don't see a dark patagial bar or a belly band, so I think we can roll out red tail. Let's take a look at those wingtips. Really pointy because they're only made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 feathers. So that makes this, just go off the shape. Don't worry about the plumage. It's a little bit of an aberrant plumage, very lightly marked, maybe on the lightest end of the spectrum. But just going off of the shape and what we know about the wingtip, this is a juvenile broad-winged hawk. And with a lot of these species, you'll see a certain amount of variability. Some of them are more heavily marked. Some of them are really, really lightly marked, like this one. One thing we do see on this bird is if we look at the tail, it has that darker tip to the tail, which is fairly common to see on the juvenile broad-winged hawks. So that's a supporting field mark you can look for. What about this bird? What are the field marks we can run through? First of all, look at the underside of the body. We have brown barring. So when I say barring, that's horizontal. And we also see the tail looks dark with a wide white band, kind of a single white band that we see. We see that the wing has a nice outline to it because it's got this dark trailing edge, so we know it's an adult. We see some markings in this area, but it's not the dark patagial bars that we would see for red-tailed hawks. And this bird is in a glide posture, so the wingtips are tucked back a little bit and the tail is folded. But looking at those wingtips, they have that more pointed appearance. And also on this species, one thing you can look for is when they're in the glide posture, they tend to have a very straight trailing edge to the wing. So there's no bulge. Sometimes they'll really push their wing forward and you'll get a little bit of an angle here. But a lot of the time you'll see this really straight trailing edge to the wing. So what is this? It is an adult broad-winged hawk. How about this bird? And let's keep it pretty simple. What's the overall coloration? It's kind of light with splotchy dark areas here on the underside of the body, as well as these square patches in the wings. And we see that the wing shape is kind of angular. They're kind of long, lanky wings that have a strong angle here. So those are all good field marks for this species, which is rough-legged hawk. Okay, let's take a look at this hawk. And first of all, seems like this bird is somewhat heavily marked. A few slides ago, we saw that really, really pale, almost completely unmarked broad-winged hawk. Take a look at this bird. We see that it's got some markings here in the underwing, even up here in this area, although it's not the dark patagial bars that we would expect to see on a red tail. It's just more that it's overall heavily marked. Got these little lines up here. And we don't really see a distinct belly band, but rather we see streaking that starts all the way up top here and extends down. Taking a look at the tail, it's a banded tail with a thicker band here at the tip. And taking a look at the wingtips, we see that they're somewhat pointy, even though this bird is in a soaring posture. So a lot of times in a glide, a lot of species will tuck their wingtips back and look more pointed. But this bird's in a soar, but the wingtips still look relatively pointed. And we see that this bird does not have a bold, dark trailing edge to the wings. It's got a little bit, and it's typical of juveniles of this species to have a little bit like this. But this is a juvenile, not the bold trailing edge of the adults. So we know it's a juvenile. What species do you think this is? That's right, it's a broad-winged hawk. So again, look at those pointed wingtips. Wingtips only made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 feathers. And again, it's just on the more heavily marked end of the spectrum. It's the same species as that really pale one we saw a couple slides ago. So you just have to get used to the variation, and in the field, you would also be able to get a sense of the size of it based on how long it took it to circle, and you'd get the sense that this was a relatively small bird. So a lot of times when you're seeing broadwings, you're seeing a lot of them, and you're kind of able to go off the shape and the way they fly. From the photos, we have to dig into some of the other field marks because you can't get a sense of that sense of motion. Taking a look at this bird, we notice that it's a dark morph. So again, completely dark here on the underside of the body and the head. And we said there's only one species where we regularly get dark morphs. So that should be our starting point. And that species was rough-legged hawk. So whenever we're seeing a dark morph, we're usually starting out with the assumption that it's a rough-legged hawk, and we're kind of going off of other field marks. Is it consistent with rough-legged hawk? You know, are the wings kind of long and lanky? Is it flying like a rough leg? Does the tail look right for rough-legged hawk? And is the time of year right? So again, rough legs are usually more cold weather birds over the winter, or in the spring migration, maybe you'd get them in March, and the fall migration, maybe November. So when we see a dark morph, we're usually looking to see, is it consistent with rough-legged hawk? And if it is, we don't need to dig into it more. Now, sometimes you'll see a dark morph bird and you say, well, that's not a rough leg. It's way too big and bulky. Or maybe you'll even see that it has a red tail. In that case, it might be a rare dark morph red-tailed hawk. Another species that sometimes shows up as a dark morph is Swainson's hawk as well. So the basic way you do it is you kind of assume that it's probably going to be a rough leg, but you want to check to make sure that you can rule out those other species. What about these birds? We look at this photo and all of the birds appear to be about the same size and shape. And looking at it, they don't look like vultures, okay? Vultures are another species that we might see in big groups, but these look like hawks. And there's only one species of hawk that we get that migrates in big groups. And so we don't even really have to look at them that closely. We just know that most of these birds, or probably all of them, are going to be broad-winged hawks. And when you have a group of broad-winged hawks circling like this, it's called a kettle. And a lot of people come to hawk watches specifically hoping to see the big kettles of broad-winged hawks. So in the fall, it's usually mid-September, right? Depending on where you are, but right around mid-September is usually the peak time for the broad-winged hawk migration. And then in the spring, up at Braddock Bay, up near Rochester, New York, we usually get them starting around mid-April. So that kind of late April, early May is the peak time when you can get the huge days. The biggest day I've had there was over 12,500 broad-winged hawks, but the record days there are more up over 30,000 broad-winged hawks in a single day. So if you're in the eastern US and you see a big group of hawks like this, it's probably broad-winged hawks. You will probably get some other species mixed in as well. It's the one thing that's fun and challenging about being a hawk watch counter is you're trying to count the broadwings, but you also need to pick out the red tails and turkey vultures and Cooper's hawks and everything else that's mixed in. But usually for these groups, almost everything is going to be broad-winged hawks, and you don't really see big groups like this of other species. Now, there are a few hawk watches that get relatively large numbers of red-tailed hawks. And so if you're going to one of those hawk watches, sometimes you'll get a group of red tails that could even be this big. Normally they're not in the huge kettles like we get with the broadwings, but just be aware of that. Some very limited number of places, they get large congregations of migrating red-tailed hawks. Here's a hawk where if you're not used to seeing them, this might be a challenging angle with the top side view. But here we see a bird that has a relatively pale head. We see the upper wings are mostly dark, but it has some white highlights on it. But maybe the main thing that stands out is that the base of the tail here is pretty white, really white base to the tail, which is a sign of this species, rough-legged hawk. And it's only the light morphs that have the white in this area. The dark morphs actually don't show this. Here's another hawk that's relatively pale looking, so we're thinking juvenile, especially with this kind of plain banded tail. See that it does not have dark patagial bars, doesn't really have a distinct belly band. It's more markings that start all the way up top. So we're thinking Okay, either juvenile red-shouldered or juvenile broadwing. And how do we tell them apart? Again, you have to look at the wingtips. So we see that the wingtip is relatively blunt or square or rounded because it's made up of 5 feathers. And we see those translucent crescents near the wingtip on both wings. And again, that's a feature that can really stand out from far away. So you would think with juvenile red shoulders and juvenile broadwings looking so similar, they'd be difficult to tell apart. But really, if you see these translucent crescents, even from a distance, you can be sure that it is a juvenile red-shouldered hawk. When you have multiple species of raptors together, you can use them to get a sense of the size comparison between them. So the hawk that we're interested in is the bottom bird here, but let's take a look at the top bird first. So this is an immature bald eagle. So we can use that as a size reference since they're flying relatively close to each other. So looking at the hawk, we see that it's smaller than the eagle, but it's still a relatively big hawk, right? It's not super tiny like you can imagine if something like an American kestrel or a sharp-shinned hawk was next to this bald eagle, they'd only be a fraction of the size. So we can get a sense of the size of this hawk. And if we look at the plumage of the hawk, we see that it's kind of a combination of light colors with splotchy dark areas. We see a lot of dark here, and we also see those dark squares on the wing. And we do not see a dark trailing edge to the wing, and the tail tip is just very diffuse. So we can identify this as a rough-legged hawk, and it's probably a juvenile because of the no dark trailing edge and the diffuse tail tip. So you're starting to get a hang of identifying hawks, and you think you're pretty good at telling red shoulders from broad wings, from red tails, and then this bird flies by. And you say, wait a second, I'm having trouble matching that up with what I know. So what do we see on this bird? What can we use as field marks? Let's look at the wings first. This bird has really long wings, and they're kind of pointed, even though it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feathers that make up the wingtip. It's still a really pointed wingtip, and it's really lanky. Look how long that wing is. And also notice that it has sort of a two-toned appearance to it. So this part of the wing is light, but the actual flight feathers themselves are all dark. So we have a really long, lanky wing with a two-toned appearance. And that is actually the field mark for this hawk, which is more common in the western US, but occasionally shows up in the east. Do you know what kind of hawk this is? I made mention of it before. This is a Swainson's hawk. Something that, if you're lucky, you might get one at your hawk watch. Even up at Braddock Bay, where we get some rarities and a really high number of hawks. We don't get Swainsons every year. Most years we might get one, but it's just a really rare bird. So it's definitely something that's really special to see anywhere in the east. All right, taking a look at this bird, we see that it's relatively pale, and with the coloration of the tail, looks like a juvenile, right? It doesn't have that bold, dark trailing edge of the wing to give the wing an outline. Just kind of got a plain banded tail. It does have a bit of a darker tip to it, though. We see that it does not have dark patagial bars, doesn't really have a belly band. And looking at the wingtips, they're relatively pointed. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4 feathers making up the wingtips. So I hope by now you're able to identify this as a juvenile broad-winged hawk. How about this one? First of all, we notice that it's a dark morph bird. And what did we say about dark morph Buteos? We said that the only species that we normally get in dark morph is rough-legged hawk. So we say, okay, we normally only get dark morphs in rough legs. We look at the shape, we look at the tail pattern, everything seems consistent with rough-legged hawk. We look at the time of year, so it makes sense that this is a dark morph rough-legged hawk. Here's a bird that maybe you saw it in the distance and you couldn't quite figure out what you were looking at because of the shape and the way it was flying, but here it is right overhead giving you a great look. Let's see if we can figure out what it is. So first of all, looking at the underside of the body, we see brown barring. We don't see dark patagial bars. We see that it has a dark trailing edge to the wings. Now looking at the wingtips, well, how many feathers are making up the wingtips? It's really hard to tell. It's a really weird shape, isn't it? And what about the tail? The tail looks super, super short, and it's kind of got this white tip to it. So actually what happened here is this is a bird that has really worn feathers. So The wingtip feathers here are worn or broken off, as well as the tip of the tail. So what we're seeing here is a white tail band, and normally there would be more sticking out past that have just worn off. So we can't go off of some of the typical field marks we would use to identify this bird, but based off of what we can see with that brown barring on the underside and a wide white band on the tail, we can identify this as an adult broad-winged hawk that just has a lot of feather wear. And that's something that you see sometimes. Not sure exactly why it happens to birds, but it's something sometimes in migration. And in the spring migration, for example, the adult broadwings migrate first. So normally if you see a bird like this, it might come later in the season when you're getting all of the juveniles migrating, just because the bird with the feather damage is having a more difficult time migrating. So just something to be aware of. Sometimes you'll see something and you might think you have something really rare, but it's just a common species that has some unusual feather wear. Here's another one that I threw in for fun. So looking at this, what do we see? First of all, look at the shape. It's got pretty long, lanky wings, doesn't it, that are somewhat pointed. Okay, and we can't make out too much about the plumage. Looks like it's mostly white underneath, kind of a brownish head. But what about the coloration of the wings? What do we see? Well, the front of the wings here look white, but the trailing edge of the wing, all these flight feathers look dark, so the wings have a two-toned appearance. And we just discussed this a few minutes ago. So what is the hawk that has really long, lanky, pointed wings and a two-toned appearance to the wings? That's right, this is a Swainson's hawk, a big rarity in the eastern US. And the last photo, we don't always see hawks in flight. Sometimes they're perched, although I'm a hawk watcher, so I prefer them when they're in flight, and I think they're easier to identify. But here's a typical view that you might get of a bird perched. So let's look at what we're able to see on this bird. First of all, the main thing that stands out to me is this area here. So we see kind of almost a herringbone pattern to some of the feathers. But we see that this upper breast area is relatively clean, and then we have dark markings going across here. We also get a little bit of a hint of one of the tail feathers, right? These feathers here, looking at the underside, with this lighting, they just kind of look white or gray. It's kind of hard to make out anything, but there's one feather here that we can see the side of it, or maybe even a little bit of the top, that it looks more reddish. So this is a bird that you might see sitting in a tree, or maybe you're driving down the highway and you see it up on a telephone pole. And the main thing that's going to stand out to you is this belly band. So what do you think this is? This is an adult red-tailed hawk. All right, you made it to the end of the quiz. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about identifying hawks in the Buteo genus. If you kept track as we went along, why don't you write a comment down below and let us know how you did. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please subscribe to Lyco Birds and check out all of our content related to raptor identification and birding in general. From Lyco Birds, this is David Brown. Thanks for watching.